Well, thank you very much, everyone who is now joining us. In 1953, our founder, Herman Miller's founder, DJ Dupree, he developed a statement of corporate values. And it included a declaration that said this: Herman Miller will be a good corporate neighbor by being a good steward of the environment. And whilst this is the case for many companies today, I'm looking forward to hearing how we can make sure that corporate sustainability is adopted, but listen to the story of how it can be a team sport. And to speak to us, we've got a guest, Sheryl Owen. She's passionate about creating a sustainable environment where everyone can thrive, and not only helps clients meet their contractual sustainability goals, but also serves as a resource to understand carbon reduction techniques and carbon tracking for their ESG reporting frameworks. Sheryl, if you want to unmute yourself, that would be really good. Thank you very much. And just to remind everyone, use the chat box questions. Sheryl, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for giving us your precious time to share your thoughts with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to the larger Herman Miller, and thank you to the audience for joining me here this morning. I love seeing an international presence here, and I can't wait to just talk about some stories about what I've experienced within the industry as to how we can make and take corporate sustainability to the next level. So a little bit about me. I am passionate about sustainability. I was recently recognized as part of a cohort of emerging leaders for GreenFin 21, so Green Finance 21. I was gracious, and I'm so excited, and I take pride in the fact that I was able to connect with financial institutions about what they can do in order to enhance their environmental goals, but then also make sure that there's a just transition to a green economy and what that looks like, right? So later on in my presentation, I'm going to start talking about what that market shift is occurring when we talk about corporate sustainability. I also have been, part of global platforms and speaking on panels. Most notably, and honestly, one of the presentations I've done that serves as a crux for honestly this presentation, the reason why I kind of want to bring this here to the forefront. I did a presentation for YPO, Young Presidents Organization, and there were a group of C-suite, CEOs who were interested in what ESG meant for them to attract and retain talent. So I gave this presentation on a panel, and it honestly serves as a crux for this presentation here today. I was like, it went great. We received great feedback, and I want to share that with the larger audience. I also was able to speak on the global platform for International Living Future Conference, specifically about the Zero Carbon Conference about decarbonization of under-resourced communities, and was able to talk about what peer-to-peer energy trading was and what's happening in the market when it comes to addressing energy burden and energy poverty, oftentimes things that we don't think about, or what is the bigger picture. And that plays a role in how you start engaging individuals and to start making corporate sustainability accessible to everyone within your organization. My background, honestly, I have a degree in civil engineering. I've worked in construction for a couple of years, and I worked in architecture. So I've experienced in the built environment, and a lot of what I talk about is going to come from that context. So we keep that in mind. I like to call myself an SDG advocate, so Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. They outline 17 goals that are considered the strategies that should be implemented in order to provide an equitable and just transition to a green economy. And recently I started my own business called Surrounded by Opportunities. And the reason I started this is because I want my clients to understand that there is an impact to someone based on the decisions that you're making. So there's a who and how that we're oftentimes not really addressing. And that's where the ESG comes in, right? Everyone focuses on the environmental aspect of it, but what about the social impact of our decisions? How are we interconnected? What is the connection to the larger ecosystem? And unfortunately, that conversation has not been happening in the past. But as I talk about that transition in the marketplace, you'll realize that that's coming to the forefront. I also want to talk about the fact that it needs to be a fair share, right? And in order for that to happen, you need to understand that people within your organization, there needs to be an organizational shift, but before that can happen, that needs to happen on the individual level. And I'm going to talk about some stories based on some projects that I've worked on that was able to successfully implement that. So let's talk about where we are going, where we have been, what has been the transition lately within the conversation around sustainability. So coming from the built environment, most of the conversation around sustainability has oftentimes focused on green building certifications or health and wellness certifications. And yes, that's still prominent. That may not be going anywhere for a while, right? But what we're seeing is that there is this shift happening where we need to align that to a corporation's more ambitious goals that we're seeing. You're seeing big companies making public statements about how they intend to achieve net zero or how they intend to address climate change. And how do they make sure that that's equitable? These are conversations that we weren't having in the past, right? So when you get a client that approaches you, they're asking for more than what they used to ask for in the past in order for them to align with their corporate goals. But in order to do that, we need to understand what those strategies look like and what are the tools that are available to us that can be leveraged in order to address that. So I know we've all been here. We've all been stressed out. And when we hear about sustainability, I'm pretty sure this is probably what you're thinking. You hear various terms. You hear ESG, environmental, social governance, right? Environmental focuses on the impact of our carbon emissions. When we talk about social impact, you may see things when we talk about diversity and inclusion within the workplace, but then you may also hear about what's happening within your supply chain. You may also ask about how do you support your community, right? So it's no longer about looking at what's within your boundary, but looking to how you're impacting things outside of your boundary. Who are you impacting outside of your boundary and how? How are you involved within the larger ecosystem? And those are the conversations that honestly, a lot of millennials, Gen Z, individuals who are probably coming into your business are interested in hearing about. So not only are you dealing with the internal struggle, right, of feeling that there's so much information, what do I do with it? What does this mean for me? But there are also other pressures that you are experiencing outside of the organization and even internally in order for you to push the next level around corporate sustainability. So I kind of listed out just a handful here of external factors, so government regulations that are occurring, right? In the UK and the EU, you have the EU taxonomy, you have the equivalent in the UK, you have similar regulations around transparency for the impact of climate change on your assets within New Zealand and even in Canada. You can research this and the list goes on and on throughout the world as to what government regulations are asking for when it comes to addressing climate change, right? And it also is no longer about just green building rating systems and being transparent about that. It's actually quantifying this information. It's also about looking at biodiversity, looking at circular economy, right? All of that is listed out in the EU taxonomy in one way, shape, or form. And that is happening globally. So that's a pressure that we're experiencing, and hence the reason why corporate sustainability is gaining so much traction. And even here in New York City, there's a price on carbon. We have something called Local Law 97, right? So there's a price on carbon and a penalty, right? So that gets to the risk management portion of the internal factors that I have listed here. That also plays a role in why this is important in our conversations as we're talking about ESG. Investors and shareholders are also asking for a level of transparency. They want to understand that their dollars are being placed into assets that addresses ESG, right? So you probably can't go anywhere with regards to investing without seeing an ESG portfolio. And that number is just continuing to grow. And that was honestly one of the conversations that we were having as part of that green fin cohort that I was talking about earlier. And it was very fascinating and interesting of what that conversation entailed. Your consumers are also pushing for this information. They're not backing down, they're boisterous, and they want you to understand that and addressing climate change is important to them. Your corporate sustainability goals are important to them. Your supply chain may also be feeling the pressure, and they may force you to kind of think about how you're dealing with your operations and vice versa. You may be also pushing them. And of course, your competition. Your competition is not backing down from these from the ambitious goals that they are holding for themselves, but then also the connection that they may have to their investors and making sure that they're upholding to what their expectations are. Your employees, so talking about attracting, retaining talent, on the next couple of slides, I'm actually going to talk about what your workforce may look like and the role that that played in some of the strategies that I've implemented on past projects for how we make that into a team sport within your organization. I touched a little bit about risk management already. There are penalties being placed out there currently just based on not being able to meet certain carbon thresholds. Your brand enhancement plays a role in this as well. Governance is about the internal structures within your organization. And as you're having these conversations and as you're peeling away the onion, you're going to find opportunities that you haven't been able to address before. So there was a research done by a consulting company. By 2029, 72% of the workforce will be millennials and Gen Z. And if you haven't seen this already in the marketplace, they are demanding that corporations set very high goals, very stringent goals, and they want to be a part of the process. This is important to them. So why aren't corporations leveraging that, right? How do they leverage that? How do they leverage the fact that they want to be a part of the process, right? 72%. So what is important and how do we engage with millennials and Gen Z and connect that to a purpose that is near and dear to them, right? And I always say this, quality over quantity. You see very ambitious and very large net zero goals, right? Net zero as it pertains to what, right? If you're talking to a millennial or Gen Z, they're not going to just accept that something is net zero. They're going to say, okay, net zero in relation to what type of emissions? Net zero as it relates to compost, net zero as it relates to some other aspect of your larger sustainability strategies. They want you to really explain and think through it. And maybe they'll even pose questions to you that you never considered before. And that's also something that I'm going to talk about is the level of engagement that I received on past projects that actually implemented what I like to call individual transformation. So this is what I've seen in the past when it comes to what different forms of transformation is. And if you haven't read something called Theory of Change, they kind of talk through what the transformation process looks like. And based on my experience, it oftentimes starts with systems transformation, right? How does it work internally within business units? And then what happens when it comes to individual transformation? So how can an individual essentially transform as their thought process as a result of the systems that are changing? And then When an organization sees that there's traction internally, but also externally as a form of their brand enhancement, that's when you see some form of acceptance on an organizational level. Okay, so that's the process that I've oftentimes seen when it comes to what transformation occurs when we talk about corporate sustainability and making it a team sport. So I want to talk about a project that I worked on a couple years ago when I was working for an architecture firm. And we did something about waste reduction. And it all started because of competition. It all started because of an industry-wide competition that focused on zero waste. And I was posed with the project. I had some form of creativity that was allowed by leadership when it came to what that implementation looked like. And it took on and it blossomed into something bigger than I honestly expected it to be. And I want to walk you through what were some of the the systems changes that occurred, the individual changes that occurred, and then how that changed on an organizational level. And then what are the internal factors that were really moving that? I would say the employees were played a huge role in that. And they actually took to it a lot more than I expected. And I heard so many stories of people who were actually happy that we started composting within the office. We often see composting as this yuck factor. And the reality is you may get a lot of people who probably already do it, and that we shouldn't run away from it. And I'm going to talk about that process of debunking myths, as I like to call it when I was talking to leadership, about what that meant for how we can implement this strategy for the office as part of a competition. So remember where this started. This started as a competition that was only supposed to last 6 months, and it actually became ingrained within the organization as a process. Of course, out of this came the brand enhancement. I'll talk about some of the benefits that occurred, right? Who was being attracted, right? Not only did it come down to the attracting and retaining, talent, but then it also came into the role that it played in addressing ESG, and of course attracting a lot of the talents for the architecture firm as well. And then governance. What were some of the business units that were intertwined within this process as well? So this is me right here as part of a panel. And it was a group of companies, and we were one of the successful companies that actually was able to reduce our waste. And it took a lot of really thinking through the process. It was the zero waste design guidelines that we used, and then started identifying what those strategies can be. So I kind of want to talk about the interconnectedness or the governance component, so the systems transformation that occurred initially as a way for us to start the process. And I'm going to spend some time here and talk through different parts of the business units that were involved with this conversation. So I'll tell you how the conversation started. Someone had approached my then boss, or my then supervisor, that said, "Hey, we would love for this company to be a part of the AIA Zero Waste Challenge." So the AIA is very similar to REBA in the UK, and I was posed with kind of taking it on. There was no handbook. It was, Sheryl, we're going to do this. Let's see what we can achieve. It was posed as something that was very short. Again, it was only supposed to be 6 months, and it came up to me to come up with a plan for what that meant. So the first conversation that honestly that I had, surprisingly, was with office services team, just to kind of pose this to them and to explain what the plan would look like and who needed to be engaged, right? What that cost looked like, right? So before we even went to leadership, and then in tandem, the sustainability team and the office services team actually went to leadership to pose this idea of implementing composting within an office space within New York City, just to kind of put things in context. And this program was implemented across 2 floors within a building, within an office building. So office services, they were on board. There wasn't much convincing on that end. They loved the idea. They said, come up with a plan for how it's going to be implemented. Let's talk through it, and then let's see what we can do. And they were on board. We talked about removing trash bins, right? So you can imagine there was a lot of pushback. Actually, a week later, I had to go around to people's desks just to make sure they weren't hiding it. And I guarantee you, there were people who hid their garbage bins. Like, that's the kind of connection that we have to some form of simplicity, right? So there was already going to be some pushback on an individual level, but we needed to start somewhere. And then we also needed to have the conversation of why we were taking away their bins, right? Why were we taking away their individual trash bins and recycling bins, and why they only needed a paper bin located in each bay, right? So when you start challenging what they think they need, and then just providing them what they actually need, you'll start getting somewhere. Of course, you'll get initial pushback, but we were able to eventually get leadership on board. And at first, like I was saying before, it was about debunking myths about compost and how much it was going to cost. All right, I posed the question to them and I said, how much do you think it's going to cost you to do composting? Every number was more astronomical than it needed to be. And that it actually was. We were supporting a local business. Our trash wasn't traveling as far. And then I'm going to talk about crafting your story, right? And what that means. Number one, when it comes to your brand, but then also when it comes to getting people on board and what that process looked like. And I started getting a lot of head nods, right, by the employees as they understood what their role was in the larger ecosystem. So remember I said, how do your decisions impact people, right? And when you're able to make that connection and show people that they're part of a larger picture, you may get more buy-in, and oftentimes you do. And then, of course, the money has to come from somewhere to pay for the composting, but having the idea of like what they think is going to cost and then what it actually did played a role in being able to push this through. And then, of course, having our marketing team involved was also important. We spoke to them and got them hyped up, for lack of a better term, about what it means to do composting, and what we were doing with regards to competing with our peers as part of this AIA Zero Waste Challenge. So we were getting buy-in and people were excited as we started to gather information. And then what we saw is that people started approaching us, right? I would tell you the first time we started the composting, we sent out an email blast to the office. I had people approach us that said, I'm so happy we're starting this in the office because I oftentimes bring my compost from home and place it in a nearby composting park or facility, right? So, I mean, that's kind of how it's laid out here in New York. I'm pretty sure in the UK, I believe you actually do have a separate composting bin that the trucks may come around and pick up. And but the case here in New York City is that we have facilities in different parts of the city, and then you would bring your compost to those locations. And oftentimes that's what people were doing. But it's not convenient, right? So if you don't have a vested interest in it, how often are you really going to do that? I also had people approaching me and saying, Sheryl, I went out for lunch and I have this object, this container that says biodegradable. Can I put this in the compost bin? Right? So these are conversations that honestly we would have never had if we did not start this program. And a part of that process also involved doing an initial baseline, just understanding where we are, and then comparing that to the following month when we started composting. And we found that 40% of what we were throwing into the trash was actually compostable, right? So just for that office, that's staggering. So you can only imagine what that can mean on a building scale, and what that can mean on a city scale. But it was eye-opening for them, and they were like, "Wow, I didn't realize that I was always just contributing to the larger conversation." And it's because of this level, or this area of invisible information that is oftentimes not available to us, because we just don't think about it, and it's just not in front of us. So we just do what is the norm. And I love that we were having these conversations. I always had these meetings in town halls where I honestly would go around and take pictures of what I saw in the compost bin. And I would call it out. I would say, "Hey, this is not working." And I would make it kind of jovial, as to, "Hey, this is great at what you're doing," or, "Hey, we need to stop doing something else," right? In order for us to make sure that we stay on top of our game, so that we're winning this competition, right? Everyone likes a little competition, especially when it comes to, in the built environment, and showing that you are a leader in any industry. You're really focusing on how you can make sure you're staying on, at the top of your game, especially when it's something within, the AIA. So after the competition, after this was done, 6 months later, we were approached, we, the sustainability team, we were approached, and we said, "What else can we do?" Right? So you're like, "Wow, I just didn't expect this to happen." And and they actually posed to us, like, "Well, how can we address the plastic bags issue within our office?" And we entertained actually engaging another company who deals with collecting, difficult to recycle items, right? Cities are not able to really take plastic bags and find a second life for them. But this another company was able to do that, and we engaged them. So again, this process started to evolve beyond just, "I don't know what we're doing. Go ask the sustainability team," right? That's oftentimes the conversation we're having, and we need to move away from that. And I'm happy that through this process, we were able to do that. And most of the individuals within our office were millennials, were younger generations, and they were happy to implement this and to find a way of how they can support the larger goals. And then we also saw people talking about and taking pride in our program that we started, and talking about it with clients, even when we're not in the room, right? So having that advocate was great when we were not even in the room. And people wanted to hear about the success stories, and what did the process take, and did it smell, and what did you do? And one thing that we always said was, "Hey, let's think about what is the amount of compost that's actually, what's going to be in your compost bin predominantly. In office space, it's going to be your coffee grounds. Your coffee grounds are a huge chunk of what oftentimes go into the garbage, and they are a natural smell suppressant." And I even said, "Why don't you offer oranges? Orange peels or tangerine peels are also another great smell suppressant, and it's great for your health." So that was also something that was implemented as part of this, just to kind of debunk, for lack of a better term, the myths around, "Hey, this is going to smell." And then we also spoke about the fact that they wanted to only do, pickup once a week. And then we ended up moving to twice a week, because it wasn't as it didn't smell, and it didn't, attract any, like, the ideas of what they think a composting facility will look like. So I was so happy that we were able to get through that hump, because I'm pretty sure that was a huge part of it, was debunking the myths that were around what this meant. So what's your story? And this is where I'm going to talk a little bit about ESG. And I know that oftentimes a lot of clients, they struggle with understanding what the story looks like and what that means, right? So again, getting back to that idea of invisibleness, right? What happens to your waste when you throw it into the garbage, right? Everyone just says, "I throw it in the garbage, I take the garbage out, and the garbage truck takes it." I don't know what happens to it after that. But I encourage you to really think about what what happens to it? And I walked the office through that. I said, your waste goes to New Jersey, your waste goes to Pennsylvania, your waste goes to Kentucky, your waste goes to South Carolina. Think of the emissions that's associated with that. And a lot of, and let's get back to the quantity of that trash that was oftentimes going to those landfills that didn't need to be there. And then I spoke about what we were doing. We engaged a local business, a local small business, a woman-owned business. They were located in Brooklyn. They used the compost at a local golf course. Yes, there is a golf course in Brooklyn. And we were able to, again, make that social impact connection, right? So again, what is the bigger picture? What is the connection to the ecosystem? That is when I started getting a lot of the head nods, right? If you don't tell people your story, how are people going to know? It's infuriating sometimes because until you ask people what is it that they're doing from a social impact standpoint, it's not really posted anywhere for you to know. And I wish corporations would leverage how powerful their larger stories are, but they need to ask those questions, right? If I didn't ask people what happens to your waste after we throw it out, we probably would have just stopped at we do composting. We probably would have just stopped at the end of the competition. But as part of leveraging that story, and as part of getting people on board and having them be intrigued about what it means to the larger ecosystem of the roles that they play in that, that's when we were able to take it to the next level. And I want to bring up a term called handprints. We understand the footprints, like our carbon footprint, the negative impact of our decisions on the environment. But that's when I also started talking to people about what handprints are, right? So how can, and I think of this, how do you reach out your hand to help and to support someone else, another entity, another organization, and to help address probably their own footprints? And that's where we start getting conversations about the supply chain. And if you've been watching what's happening in the marketplace, you're seeing conversations about how supply chain impacts a corporation's ESG goals, right? So who we engage with and what they do in their organization also impacts our footprint. So how do we support them and bring them along on the journey as we talk about corporate sustainability, right? So we talk about an individual level, but then we're also looking at the systems that exist as we connect with the supply chain. And this played a role in our brand enhancement for sure. And there were a number of entities that wanted to understand what we were doing, why we were doing it, and to talk about the success stories and possibly even some of the pushback that we received. Right. And we were able to get the marketing team involved. Even our marketing team was doing so much press release around this, right? And then as this occurred, right, our brand enhancement, that's when we also started seeing some kind of organizational change occurring. So I often had HR coming and talk to me and saying like, hey, I just did an interview and we spoke about the composting program, right? So again, this is about understanding that they are using this as a way to attract talent. Our industry peers, right? When I did the panel and even after the panel, I even still have people who come up to me and talk to me about the program and what was done. So people in the industry recognize this and you're seen as a leader. Clients, I actually had clients come into the office to actually take a look at the process and walk them through it. And of course, I spoke about marketing and communications. They were also leveraging this as a way to enhance the brand. So why did our clients care, right? So our clients were specifically in the development real estate industry, and of course they cared because they internally have their own ESG goals, right? So they see this as a way of leveraging that. They see it as a way to be ahead of their competition, similar to how we demonstrated what our capabilities were to our competition. simultaneously, they were able to see that. And imagine if they were able to scale that up much larger than we did. Their consumers, their customers are also asking for this information. So your investors and your shareholders. And then, of course, when we talk about what the opportunities are for them to identify when it comes to looking at the larger context. So again, we were able to tell our story just based on 2 floors within an office space. Imagine what a developer can do if they were able to implement this on a bigger scale and what that meant for their own internal ESG reporting. ESG reporting happens on an annual basis, right? So how can they communicate that to their investors and shareholders? So we speak a lot about ESG, and this has been gaining a lot of traction over the past couple of years and is at the forefront now in corporate sustainability. And before I was talking about what net zero means, what that meant in the larger picture, right? So when people say net zero energy, they're probably speaking about what's considered scope 2 emissions. So scope 2 emissions is just the energy that your building is using, right? So as you can see, that's only 1/3 of the equation, but most of the times that's where our conversations are towards. And we may talk about some of the company assets, right? Maybe we're thinking about company vehicles that can be hybrid or EV, right? Those are their scope 1 emissions. Are they talking about net zero as it pertains to scope 1 and scope 2? But still, that's not the whole picture. And then we have scope 3 emissions, and that's where composting comes in here, right? I circled it here. And being able to quantify that information will be beneficial to their ESG reporting. And scope 3 emissions is a huge chunk of our greenhouse gas emissions that we're not accounting for. So think about what corporations can do in order to address their scope 3 emissions. And you're seeing more conversations happening around supply chain because of this. So I can't take credit for this. This I found on LinkedIn, and I found it so funny and absolutely true, right? So initially, everyone wants to be involved with company sustainability, whatever that means for and defined by the company. But then when we start thinking about and approaching it from adjusting our business processes and business model, that's when we start to lose people, right? So this example shows that we are able to essentially take things from a systems transformation, then move to an individual transformation, and then move to an organizational transformation. That has more success than trying to go outright and trying to change from an organizational standpoint. I want to talk about one more project here, an employee commuter survey. And that's essentially how it started out. It started out like, hey, we just want to do a commuter survey. And let's just see where it goes. That's really how it started with a client. And that's because they were interested in a health and wellness certification. And then I want to talk about how that blossomed into something bigger, and what it meant for them from a systems standpoint, and the role that it meant for them from an individual transformation standpoint. And we haven't been able to leverage and talk about gamification, and that's essentially what was done here in order to engage the employees. So don't underestimate the role of a little competition internally, especially if you understand your audience. So this company, the predominant amount of the audience was millennials, Gen Z, very young population. So they were all for it, and they wanted to understand how essentially they can reduce their footprint. So again, it's about putting things in front of them. And believe it or not, I was actually reading an article this morning on LinkedIn about the role of gamification in helping to change individuals' views or mindsets around their environmental contribution or their impact on climate change. I've shared it on my LinkedIn profile if you ever want to go in and read it. It was actually very interesting. But the role of gamification can really help you leverage the changes that you probably want to see in order to support your ESG reporting. So I kind of want to go back to my little slide here. So when we talk about employee commuting, that again plays into our scope 3 emissions. And that was one thing, again, that can be leveraged as part of the larger ESG reporting that was done for that company. So we created like a leadership board. We from our commuter survey, we understood what we wanted to ask, and then it turned into something bigger. And then we did it during the summer months, right? People are more inclined to actually saying, let me take a bike ride, or let me go for a walk, or let me go for a run. And of course, there were facilities there or amenities there in order to help address, if they wanted to take a shower, or if they wanted to bike and they had somewhere to store their bikes, the amenities were there for them to support that. But the leadership board created some kind of internal competition, mainly around the younger generation that was there. And I want to talk about our process that we use, right? So we talk about first planning and management, right? Creating a baseline, understanding our footprint, asking the bigger questions about how we are impacting the larger conversation, and then what does that mean for reporting? Okay, and then of course you want to make sure that that's a part of your story. And I put it back in the circle, right? There needs to be a feedback loop, right? And oftentimes and currently, a lot of companies understand what they're going to do. They understand how they're going to do it, right? So what can be, I want to reduce my energy, I'm going to change, I'm going to update my mechanical system, let's say. Or, hey, I want to understand ESG frameworks. That's how I'm going to do it. But their purpose is oftentimes lacking. And then oftentimes we gather this information, but then we don't know how to synthesize it into something that's understandable for how it's connected back to the larger picture. And that's oftentimes what's missing. And that's why I say there needs to be a full circle in this process. So I want you to check out our website, look at some of the training sessions that we offer. I have a promotion going on right now, 30 free 3-minute, 30-minute conversations for 30 days. So 30 promotion. And it's focusing on revamping your story, setting climate action goals, and the role of ESG on your limited carbon budget, right? So take a look at that, and I hope that you are able to take advantage of it. And please check us out on LinkedIn and on Instagram. And again, I just want to say thank you to Herman Miller. Thank you to you, the audience, for allowing me to be a part of your journey as you're talking and thinking about corporate sustainability. And I also want to give a shout out to a friend who actually introduced me to Herman Miller and allowed me to be a part of this platform, Katerina, who's in the UK. So thank you for that. And I am happy to take any questions.
Sheryl, thank you for that. If you could stop sharing, that would be good, so we can just see you. Thank you very much. Just so that you all know, we will be sending the slide deck to you afterwards. And we have a question. Bertie, did you want to ask the question that's on the Q&A for me, please? And I have a couple of other questions. So
sure. Absolutely, Sheryl, that was fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. I've got a question here from Thomas Mee, and he asks, in the majority of cases, what are the blockers to more ESG adoption across a business?
I would say the S right now, right? Because it's still very much viewed as a nice to have, right? A pat on the back. And we haven't been able to really set metrics that are consistent across the board. And I oftentimes say, are we ever going to have metrics that are consistent across the board when it comes to the S in ESG? I would say that is probably one of the biggest blockers that currently exists when we're trying to address the E and ESG, or the S in ESG. The E and ESG is definitely being quantified, and it's a part of a lot of government regulations, like I was saying before, and a lot of penalties that are placed out there. But trying to get people on board to understanding what that bigger picture means, especially if they haven't been able to see the impact that it has on their brand yet, is the most difficult.
thank you. What are the best ways to measure success when it comes to ESG? Is there a tool that you recommend, or is it otherwise it becomes box ticking?
Yeah, I may sound a bit biased when it comes to the ESG framework that I oftentimes gravitate towards. I personally like the science-based targets. as a way to talk about what goals you're setting, right? And because science-based targets don't allow you to kind of cheat and buy offsets and green power in order for you to offset your greenhouse gas emissions. So that's one way of demonstrating it. But a lot of ESG frameworks, depending on where you are in the process, can be helpful. So there's CDP reporting, right, where that's just being transparent and asking you the right questions and allowing you to set your baseline, right? It all depends on where you are in the process of being able to identify what your ESG goals are. But I will say that I do like the science-based targets, or the SBTs, because it does set a target for you for what you need to achieve within 2030 and subsequently 2050.
Great, thank you. One from me, actually. The built environment is actually highly responsible for a lot of the CO2 emissions. And you're an engineer, and have you seen any sort of engineering changes, developments that have had a positive impact on those CO2 emissions? What changes have you seen in that area?
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of traction right now when it comes to addressing embodied carbon, especially when it comes to the materials that are being selected, what happens to those materials at the end of life, and how can we start talking about a circular economy, right? So having conversations with manufacturers, in addition to having conversations with your structural engineers. And I even see a lot more clients even saying, I want an embodied carbon assessment, again, because that helps them with their own ESG reporting, right? So their ESG scope 3 emissions, right? 90% of their greenhouse gas emissions, a part of that is about embodied carbon, and they want to be able to quantify it.
Sheryl, thank you very much. It's been a fascinating talk. I have put Sheryl's website link in, and we're going to be, so we might have a question. Great to see the link between systems, individual, and organizational transformation. Would you always look to systems transformation first, or start with the individual, or do the couple run in parallel? What approach have you found is most successful across the order of these in engaging and getting traction?
I would say attacking the systems first, right? Understanding how the business units interact with each other and identifying who those allies can be is key to initially starting that conversation. And those allies can, of course, be on an individual level as to what they can do, and maybe having an advocate within those business units for you can also be supportive. But I see having a game plan on a systems level as to how things interact and being able to clearly communicate that is key. And then individuals will start getting on board and start asking the questions that they want to see. And then when that transformation happens and the organization sees that, you start seeing an organizational change. Maybe not as far as changing their business model, but maybe taking a look at their business processes.
Thank you. Rebecca asks, is there a disparity in reporting between publicly owned companies and privately held companies? Are publicly held companies held to a higher standard, possibly?
Yeah, the level of transparency that occurs if you're publicly traded, right? So there's reporting that is required to be done. If you have a board members and if you're connecting with shareholders and investors, that level of transparency is going to be required. And then if you're reporting to, I'm going to go to the EU taxonomy, right, where the transparency is being asked for currently from financial institutions, right, banks, and that in turn is requiring companies to also be transparent about what they're doing, just so that they can then use that as part of their overarching impact assessment is going to be key. So I would say publicly traded organizations are currently being held to a standard. Privately owned, they're not really following a standard per se. There are a lot of ESG frameworks, but they may not have to, as compared to maybe if something is publicly traded.
Yeah, I guess that's where that competition and your customers start to drive activity there. And final question here: how were you able to educate the employees on what they should and shouldn't compost on that project?
So we actually did a whole poster um, and placed it in the centralized garbage space. And we listed out what they should put into specific bins, what they should not. We actually ended up adding in a separate area for the plastic bags later on. That was a part of the training. But then during town halls, like I was saying, I was taking pictures. So like one picture I took, someone actually placed an apple wrapped in saran wrap um, into the into the compost bin. I took a picture and I said, "Hey guys," I called it out. We were jovial about it, but it was a way of educating them to be more cognizant about it, right? So it's about how do you challenge the social norms.
Sheryl, this has been fascinating. Thank you very much for giving up your time. We will follow this up. The video will go on YouTube if any of you want to share it with your colleagues. The slide deck will be in an email tomorrow. And do join us we have lots more webinars. Next week, I have one I'm talking about collaboration. And the following week, we have the Architects MCM looking at hybrid working as well. Sheryl, do stay because all the thanks will normally come. We don't get rounds of applause anymore, but we get lots of thank yous in the chat box. Sheryl, thank you very much for your time. And everyone, thank you very much for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate that. Thank you, Sheryl. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Herman Miller, for the opportunity.
Our pleasure. Thank you.